So we might as well kick off. We start recording.
Right. So, just for those listening, do you want to just introduce yourself before we start asking the questions?
Sure. My name is Patrick Deneen. I'm a professor of political science at the University of Notre Dame in Indiana, United States.
All right.
I suppose I'll kick off the questions. Well, I suppose we should just tell the listeners firstly about your new book. I believe it's June 6th that came out. Is that right?
Sounds right. Yes.
Just about a couple of months old. Have it here with me now. It's an amazing book. About Patrick Deneen's views on the liberal society and his alternative, which is what we're going to be talking about today. And so I suppose we'll start off this question. And we're not going to go into why you think liberalism failed, because people should buy the book and read it if they want to know that. But I suppose going into your solution, I suppose. So in practical terms, how do you promote custom and virtue in a society for which a large part of it has already lost it?
Mm-hmm. Well, I can see you're starting with the easy questions. The record of political and social orders reversing course after a kind of tipping point, is not very good. It seems that once decline sets in, it's difficult to reverse course. So I don't have an answer in one sense, which is that there's no guarantees that we haven't reached a tipping point in terms of decline. But you don't know where you are on the sort of the civilizational decline scale at any given time. So I think one has to proceed on at least the somewhat realistic assumption, or I should say the hopeful assumption that it's not too far past the point of reversal. Maybe it's a little bit like we could compare it, like the ancient Greeks would always compare political orders to the human body and a kind of natural lifespan. And so if we think about it in terms of a body, I'm 59 years old. I'm starting to feel creaky bones and so forth, but I'm also doing what I can to maintain health. And so realistically, we're all gonna decline and pass away. But I think there are things you can do to maintain the current health of what we have, improve some things. And I think that's really what the viewpoint we should have, that we should be realistic in some sense, that prospects are actually rather daunting at the moment. That's really quite a significant challenge. But my main advice would be, younger people like you. I'm very fortunate to teach a lot of younger people in college. I get to interact with a lot of younger people in talks, lectures, travel, and so forth. I sense a really, for those who are thinking and really concerned about our situation, I sense a real hunger to change course. And you all will be running the world in 20 years, maybe less, and it's kind of up to you. So I hope those signs of hope and the desire for renewal are promising little growth buds that could flourish into something. But it's a very challenging question, and not one without an easy answer.
Well, I suppose we'll go into your sort of philosophy then, I suppose, about Aristotle populism, basically. Oscar, if you want to ask the second question there.
Yeah. So towards the end of the regime change, you talk about using Machiavellian means for Aristotelian ends. And I wondered what you thought these look like in practice. Is it sort of populist politics? What kind of thing is that?
Yeah. So I think if one hasn't read the book or has a pretty significant familiarity with both Machiavelli and Aristotle, one might draw certain conclusions about what I meant by that. Machiavellian means, most people would hear that and think, oh, he means we should do anything, right? All means are justified by the ends that one holds or aims at, and that is a Machiavellian teaching. But that's not what I meant in that particular passage or that particular phrase. I'm speaking specifically about the relationship between the two main classes that exist in any society. Today we would talk about it as the working class, the lower middle class, those who especially I think are doing less well or even poorly in the contemporary economic and social order. And that's what a lot of the book is about. A kind of global elite that actually benefits from the very conditions that are making it difficult for the working class to succeed today. So there have been two approaches philosophically in the classical and pre-modern tradition, that one of which suggests that the way in which this divide can be perhaps ameliorated or even improved, rendered not only dangerous, but actually recreated or let's say modified so that it can actually be beneficial to society. There have been two main approaches, and one of them is the Aristotelian approach, which is a kind of effort to kind of mix the two classes, to mix the two orders of society. And this form of mixing, he talks about kind of mixing offices, mixing the way in which the two classes interact, to the point in which the two classes start to disappear and become more like one class. And he's kind of speaking about a broad middle class, but he's also talking about this in terms of moderating. Of course, the great Aristotelian theme of virtue as a form of moderation, the means between extremes, a kind of moderation between the kinds of pathologies that result from an elite, like the elite that we have today, but also the pathologies that arise from populism, from the kind of unleashed power of the many. That's one approach, is this kind of idea of mixing. The other approach was proposed by Machiavelli in his work, The Discourses, perhaps less well known. And there he argues that the greatness of Rome was especially achieved because of a kind of conflict, an ongoing kind of clash between the two classes that kind of ended up canceling out the power of the other, so that rather than seeking a mixing through a kind of blending, through a kind of creation of a new class, Machiavelli believed that it was a kind of clash of the two powers that especially reigned in the excesses and the powers of the elites, that it was the kind of political power and willing to be conflictual and confrontational of the populace of the many that gave rise to the greatness of Rome. So when I speak of Machiavellian means to Aristotelian ends, it's precisely in this formulation, which is that for now, at this time, in which I think we have a kind of dominance of elites in our society, a kind of oligarchy, in using the classical terminology, what's needed in the first instance is a kind of forceful response by the many, by populists, and that response is to extract concessions and a kind of moderation of the behavior and the advantages of the elites today, but not with an end, in my view, to the kind of Machiavellian constant conflict and ongoing confrontation between the classes, but with a view to establishing and hopefully creating a more Aristotelian settlement of a kind of mixing, a form of moderation. So I see it almost as a kind of two-step process, and that's why I say it's Machiavellian means to Aristotelian ends. That it's first, what's needed is a kind of a forceful confrontational approach by a more populist dimension in our politics, but not with an end to having ongoing, continuous, and unceasing conflict, but hopefully with an end to the creation of a much more moderate and moderated, more general middle class is the proposal in that section of the book.
In terms of Machiavelli, though, so would you agree with the general consensus over the last 400, 500 years that he's been a teacher of evil, and that in terms of, like, you say Leo Strauss is a big influence on you, of course, and I believe Leo Strauss accused him of being immoral and irreligious. So would you say that the means don't necessarily have to lead to the ends, as in they can be separated somehow?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, well, that's a great question. Of course, Strauss, that line by Strauss has always been very arresting and yeah, the source of much fascination, to call Machiavelli the teacher of evil. Machiavelli, I suppose, I would lay down a marker, and the reason why I say I don't prefer or recommend Machiavellian means to Machiavellian ends is that I regard Machiavelli's ends to be the most problematic and the most. So most people regard Machiavelli's sort of consequentialism, to use the philosophical term, his argument that you can use, immoral means to achieve certain ends. Machiavelli, actually, it's less his consequentialism that constitutes the innovation of Machiavellian teaching. I think many people think that, Machiavelli is the first teacher of consequentialism, the ends justify the means in the Western political tradition, and that's not the case, right? You see all kinds of consequentialist thinking in Plato. I mean, he makes a recommendation, for example, of the idea of a noble lie in the Republic. He makes a recommendation of, deception at various points. Augustine in The City of God says it's probably necessary for political leaders to engage in, I mean, he actually goes so far as to say torture in order to enforce the law. That there's always the problem of what's called dirty hands in politics. And Machiavelli didn't invent that idea. Machiavelli was not the inventor of the idea that politics in the world that we live in is one that always requires a certain recognition that a kind of purity is probably not available to us when we deal in the world of politics. At the very basic level, there are people who intend us harm, and that you're probably going to have to engage in forms of violence and war to protect your people. And violence and war is never clean, and it's never pure. And this has been known long before Machiavelli. So the problem, it seems to me, with Machiavelli's arguments is less the idea that there's always going to be the need to think about what are the times and occasions in which means that are not pure or purely moral may be necessary. What Machiavelli introduces is an argument that politics is really fundamentally about advancing our interests, advancing the interests of human beings, and not to see politics as the sphere in which a kind of human good or even a transcendent good can be achieved. And in that sense, this is perhaps, I would conclude, or I would be tempted to conclude, that this is what Strauss means when he says Machiavelli is a teacher of evil. That Machiavelli proposes a vision for politics in which the aim and end of politics must, in some ways, be limited only to fulfilling the base part of human nature, right? The part of human nature that's really just interested in fulfilling our interests, fulfilling whatever bodily interests, interests of glory, and so forth. And that the ends of politics that had been recommended by the pre-modern and pre-Machiavellian tradition, which included virtue, the human good, the aspiration for the divine, those have to be put to the side. And in that sense, I think I would wholeheartedly reject Machiavellian ends.
Yeah.
And that's where I think I would differentiate. I would differentiate myself strongly from Machiavelli. The purpose that Machiavelli serves, just in that brief phrase in the book, is really just focused on that fairly brief passage in his discourses in which he talks about the relationship between the elites and the populace. And that's really the extent to which I'm really using Machiavelli in the book. And so it's for very limited and very sort of a very specific definition of what I mean by Machiavellian there. So I would just, for you and for anyone who's maybe listening to this, it's to be aware that when I speak of Machiavellian, it's not in the, I think, the more expansive way in which we typically think of Machiavelli.
But in terms of, you talked about how pre-modern and ancient philosophers promote this idea of virtue, but Machiavelli is not the first of his time to promote this idea of hedonism and self-serving human interest, because you have like the Epicureanism of the Greeks and utilitarians like Jeremy Bentham and stuff. So how did they help to form the liberal order? And also, could you say that, argue that Machiavelli is also responsible for things?
Yeah. Oh, no, I mean, in this sense, there's probably nothing new under the sun. And I am certainly, I would say, my debts to Leo Strauss are probably especially visible in the way in which I generally categorize the history of political thought as a divide broadly between ancients and moderns, and then subdivisions within that. But that can be an artificial division, because of course there's what a sort of Strauss or Straussian thinkers would categorize as a variety of modern thought, of course, existed in antiquity. It existed in Epicurean thought, for example. So the kind of Hobbesian tradition, or even if we reach back to Machiavelli, the kind of tradition of again lowering the sights of politics to the more sort of primordial, basic physical needs and desires, the satisfaction. You mentioned Bentham, right? Utilitarianism as a society that seeks to maximize pleasure and minimize pain, for example, for the greatest possible number. That there's nothing new under the sun in that sense. That's existed for a long time. The reason why I think they can be justly categorized as ancient and modern is that Epicureanism, broadly speaking, was regarded philosophically and politically, I would say, at least as a matter of sort of official, what is the dominant political philosophy of the time. It was regarded as disreputable, as not the dominant way of thinking of or understanding the aspirations of politics. That for the classical period, the dominance of the kind of Platonic and Aristotelian understanding, but then especially under Christendom, the long period from the decline of the Roman Empire into the Renaissance period and even beyond, Epicureanism was regarded as a immoral philosophy, and not the regulative philosophy that was at least what was supposed to be the aspiration for politics. And I would say what distinguishes modernity from antiquity in this sense is not that people didn't think these thoughts. It was what was the regulative philosophy, and the kind of what philosophical approach, or even more broadly, assumptions about human nature predominated in thinking about our political arrangements. And there I would say one of the distinguishing marks of modernity is the sort of reputational change of figures in the broadly Epicurean tradition to becoming the dominant and indeed the regulative thinkers. And so we live in an age, certainly, that's deeply shaped and influenced by the thinking of Hobbes. I think especially Hobbes, that politics is about securing peace. It's not about orienting us to the greatest good, to the summum bonum, the finis ultimus, the end or purpose or telos of human beings. That politics is about seeking the base conditions of domestic peace and international, kind of the protection of the nation from international threats. So in that respect, I think you're correct that these lines of thinking have a long lineage, but the ways in which they have become influential in our society, I think that reflects a difference of one of the differences between antiquity and modernity.
Okay, very interesting. So are you saying that the toxic materialism that we're saying in today's society, the natural fulfillment of like the recognition and acceptance of Hobbesian materialism in the philosophical sense, and also the fall of like philosophers like Saint Augustine and Aristotle in people's day-to-day lives?
Yeah, again, these are very deep, subterranean, foundational sets of beliefs. But just one marker would be, how is it that we think about material things in our world? And you could say we're absolutely surrounded and suffused with the belief that to accumulate, be wealthy, to be successful means to be successful in our society means the accumulation of the greatest possible wealth. We regard as our kind of heroes of our society, people like Steve Jobs or Bill Gates. Contrast that with a society that regards material accumulation as in all, generally as a sin, as a form of covetousness or lust, that the state of your soul is imperiled by excessive material goods, that a society ought to be ordered not around the ideal of accumulation, but around ideals of saintliness, even self-denial. So I think it's clear that something fundamental has changed. What hasn't changed is that human beings like material things. That hasn't changed, right? But what has changed is the way in which we evaluate those material things. One worldview in which it views those material things as necessary, but also as potential sources of peril for our souls, peril for our kind of our broader health as well as our health. And as sources of societal dysfunction. And another approach, which is the dominant approach today, which regards accumulation as an inherent kind of good. And again, we're suffused not just with the kind of the philosophical form of that belief. Nobody's reading Hobbes, or very few people are reading Hobbes. But if you just look at the way in which sort of advertising takes place, the kind of the general ethos that's propounded in our media and so forth, you couldn't but help conclude that we live in a world in which we are to want and desire, and that, as Hobbes says, there's no limit to our desires. We desire power after power, the ability to accumulate thing after thing, he says, that ceaseth only in death. And there's nothing that can, in some ways, limit that. There's no limiting principle to that other than our ability to get what we want in a world in which other people are contending with us. And if we can arrange the world in which we can limit the amount of violence in that pursuit, then all the accumulation of power, wealth, things is all for the good.
Yeah. So,
sorry, just to talk about the political sphere. I'm sorry, there's some background noise, but one assessment of populism as a political movement is that it's a political manifestation of a general dissatisfaction and unease among sort of lower middle class, left behind people. And people also would suggest that this makes it fertile bed for sort of bad actors offering simple explanations, us and them sort of stuff, blame game, and especially people on the far right. How can we sort of guard against that, would you say? And is there a way to avoid that sort of infiltration of the movement and use it in the sort of the Machiavellian means assert itself? Is there a way around that?
Yeah. So it's a great question. And so I guess I should say something for, again, I'm not sure if who's listening to this. Clearly you've read the book and you've taken it, you've read it with care and taken some notes. But for those who may not be as familiar with the argument, what really motivated me to write the book was obviously in the context of our current politics, the division that's, we can see it across liberal societies everywhere in the West today and even beyond the West, the divide between the kind of many and the few, this populist uprising that's happening, of course, all over Europe. It's happening in the United States, happening with Brexit in Britain. It's happening outside the sphere of the European, Brazil, India, and so forth. So it's a global phenomenon. It's something that's happening, it seems to me, because of dynamics related to globalization, related to the kind of internationalization of our economic order and the integration of our political order, the EU being one example of that. But this kind of integration of the global economy and the global politics kind of unfolding hand in hand. And again, it has created conditions which has especially benefited a relatively small percentage of the population, which are globalist in their disposition, in their training, in their education, in the way in which they are able to succeed on the sort of terms of this new global economic, political, social order that we're living in. It has meant, in effect, the dismantling of more local forms of existence, or let's say the kinds of institutions, organizations, and practices that prioritized more, I would say, local, regional, and even national forms of existence. So those have been increasingly disassembled or demoted in importance as this globalized structure has been created. I think the main reason for the increasing political divide between the classes is precisely in this, as a result of the kind of increasing gap between the benefits accruing to a small class of kind of global elites and the challenges that are being faced by those who are sort of left behind in these more local circumstances. Again, the kind of more working class. This divide is giving rise to a politics of a kind of zero-sum game in which one side largely believes that it must win and destroy the other side. That the only way in which to achieve political success is either by eliminating the elites or eliminating the kind of the political power of the populists. And this approach and this understanding is precisely what in the classical tradition is written about as like one of the worst possible outcomes for politics. You cannot eliminate one side of the ledger. What you can attempt to do is achieve a kind of, as we were talking about earlier, a kind of either Machiavellian stasis, a kind of Machiavellian balance, or an Aristotelian blending. And if you don't achieve that, then what you're likely to have is either civil war, which we may be kind of experiencing now, or tyranny, despotism. So either anarchy or despotism are the kind of two worst possibilities, and the two tend to go together, or a resolution in which the two sides kind of are able to reach a kind of compromise. What this also means is that each side is prone to excess, the excessive desire to impose its preferences on the other side. And in the case of populists, this is especially achieved through its attraction to demagogues. And again, this is a teaching of the classical tradition. The desire to attach its star to a political figure who says, I am the leader of the people, and I will lead the people to achieve their desires. And the danger of demagogues is not only that they are they're potentially despotic figures who, with the kind of power and energy of the people, can become, wrecking balls of the elite orders of society. But it seems to me the real danger of demagogues is that they don't deliver on their promise to the people, that they're actually self-serving. And this is one of the real great dangers of demagogues, is that they use the frustrations and the resentments of the populace in order to simply to benefit themselves and their family. And I think, we have some evidence to think that that's something that's been happening in our politics. I think certainly in the United States, we can see evidence for that. So I think the argument of the book, the effort of this book, is to say, if we don't want the worst case scenario to take place, we actually need to think about a way that the many and the few can achieve, I would hope, a kind of more Aristotelian form of compromise. And this is where moving beyond, I think, the extreme liberalism of the elite classes today, and I could say more about what I mean by liberalism, but that the more populist part of our politics represents a kind of a kind of intuitive conservatism that's contrary to the, let's say, the really extreme forms of liberalism that we see, especially embodied in the elite classes today. Those extreme forms of liberalism are especially a kind of placelessness, kind of the idea that there's no geographical boundaries, there's no specific, either national, regional, or even local identity that I have to have a kind of loyalty toward. The idea that we are actually self-making creatures, that we literally can make ourselves and remake ourselves, which includes our sexuality, that's simply something that we can change if we desire. And at a very deep level, I think attached to these things, a kind of condescending rejection of the idea of either traditional values or even at a deeper level piety, the idea that we owe piety and a kind of reverence to the divine. And these are areas that in the classical teaching, the people represent and often are the defenders of these more, we would say, traditional values or traditional way of life. They tend to be more rooted. They tend to be more in touch with the stuff of the world. They tend to be working with the stuff of the world, either farmers or today in the trades, electricians and so forth. They tend to be the embodiment of common sense. And that word common has two meanings here. It's that which is shared and that which is ordinary, right? And common sense is that sense you get from just living for a long time in a relatively local space where you just develop common sense. We know how things work, and we're not going to have crazy ideas about things. And that there tend to be the embodiment of a kind of traditional and even kind of conservative way of life and a traditional piety. The elites tend to be people who are anti-traditional, who want to break with the traditional. So part of what would constitute the compromise and a kind of new integration, as it were, of the many and the few in this Aristotelian view would be to cultivate or to enforce, through a kind of Machiavellian means, through confrontation, to force the elites to be attentive to and respectful of these conditions of the many, of the ordinary people, and kind of enforce and create a new elite that is not as wed to the world view and to the practices that lead to their specific advantages, but to embrace those conditions that especially are necessary for the flourishing of ordinary people. So that's really the, I'm sorry if that I've gone on long here, but that's really the kind of the core argument of the book. And this is what really is, I think, points to a post-liberal world, which is that it recognizes that a substantial part of the human population, the kind of ordinary working class people, what we would think of today as the populists, are not oriented toward this kind of trajectory of liberalism that I was describing, and that liberalism needs to, in some ways, ultimately limit itself if it doesn't want to give rise to the conditions that lead either to tyranny or to anarchy.
I just have two questions in relation to that response. I suppose the first would be one of the main criticisms of the book was the fact that people accuse it of having a divisive and hostile tone towards the gay community. And I suppose what their criticism would have been is that why do you need these what they view to be arbitrary Catholic values in a post-liberal order?
Yeah, it's a little odd to me because I don't think there's anything in the book that's at any point that's specifically based in Catholic theology.
Mm.
And in many ways, maybe that's a fault of the book because I am a Catholic and I believe in Catholicism, but I also don't want to limit my audience to Catholics. And on the other hand, of course, Catholicism, as we can go back to Thomas Aquinas, Catholicism is not simply arbitrary. It's the beliefs of Catholics are based not only in revelation, they're based in reason. And so one can make arguments on behalf of what are values or beliefs that are consonant with Catholicism, but not limited merely to a Catholic audience, because one can make those arguments based on reason. And I personally don't think, or I wouldn't conclude that there's hostility toward gays in this book, although we are living in an age in which to be critical, for example, of gay marriage is regarded as hostility. I don't regard criticism of gay marriage as hostility to gays. I regard it as a defense of marriage as it should be properly understood. So I would describe it in the following way. Marriage is a social and even political institution that's a reflection of the created order. So it is not something that human beings ourselves merely create because it's something that we want. It is rather something that we envelop something natural, which is the union between a man and a woman that brings forth new life. We envelop it in a certain kind of social and even political form because it is vitally important for the future of humanity and the future of every civilization to instantiate norms and institutions around that natural relationship and the fact that it can bring forth new life. Now, that's not arbitrary. That's just simply a fact in nature. In fact, it's the opposite of arbitrary. It's given. It is a reality. What's arbitrary is to say that marriage can be whatever we say it is. That's what's arbitrary. Arbitrary is to say marriage is whatever a democratic society says it is. It can be a marriage. A marriage can be between a man and a tree, or a dog and a cat, or what you will. And I don't mean to denigrate anyone by this, but what I mean by saying arbitrary is that there is a reason why marriage exists, and it is not for an arbitrary reason. It is because of the fact that the union of a man and a woman is the only union that can bring forth new life. It's not to say that every marriage between a man and a woman will bring forth life, but only the only union that can bring forth new life is the union between a man and a woman. And that's the reason for marriage. So what's regarded as, if in any way critiques of me are that this constitutes divisiveness or hostility, this is really a fundamental misreading. It's really just it seems to me, a very
Face value.
What one once would have been a kind of common sense and almost ordinary argument about what the nature of marriage is. What's changed today is that we have fundamentally, it seems to me, redefined what we regard to be arbitrary, or what we regard to be the reason and purpose for such institutions. So in that sense, I actually think I'm the one being non-arbitrary, and it's those who are critiquing me who, in fact, are defending a certain kind of arbitrariness that's built into a kind of positivistic understanding of law.
But I suppose in terms of, we talked about what we need the marriage to advance humans and continue civilization. But in terms of the traditional beliefs, do you feel like that could possibly stifle like innovation, technologically speaking? Because in terms of like you're very critical of technocracy in the book, and the idea that there's such called experts and that they're common good, but if there's a balance, there has to be a sort of balance there, because there is obviously some people who know more than others, even though there is knowledge passed through time.
Right. Yeah, the critique of technocracy and the defense of common sense is a particular kind of argument. Again, something that goes back to antiquity. You can't read Plato and avoid coming across arguments for who should rule.
Yeah.
And this is, it's of course a difficult and challenging question, but it seems to me that one of the things that one has to conclude from classical antiquity and even to today, and the arguments of classical antiquity, is that the claims of expertise or technocracy are always going to be confronted by the complexity of our human reality. There's no expert knowledge that can encompass all of the complexity of the complex reality, right? The variegated reality that we live in. So reliance upon expertise is, of course, is essential and more essential than ever in the modern world, which is more complex in part because of all of our technology. But this reliance on expertise often shades into, as I think we've seen in recent years, it shades into an overconfidence that experts are the best and only people to determine certain kinds of decisions in our political order. So the phrase you hear often, follow the science, right? Trust the experts. These are reflections of this overconfidence that a certain kind of expertise gives you the ability to make judgments well beyond what your expertise speaks to. If you read the Apology of Socrates in the works of Plato, there's a great moment where Socrates talks about who are the wisest people, or he searches for someone who's wiser than himself, and he says he actually discovers real knowledge among people who know how to do things. He's talking about carpenters and so forth, and he says those people really do have expertise. They know how to build a table. They know how to build a chair. So if you want to know how to build a table or chair, that's who you go to. He says the problem is these people then, because they know this thing, they assume they know things about everything, or that go well beyond what it is they know about. And it seems to me that that's not a bad way of thinking about, for example, what we went through recently with COVID, and the idea that the people in charge of virology and understanding what viruses are and do, that these people should be put in charge of social and political policy, and that their expertise gave them special insight into how we should respond to these viruses as a social and political and economic matter. That was almost a kind of re-articulation of the claim of the carpenters in the Apology of Socrates. And that's really my critique of the technocracy. Now, this is not to say that in any way, shape, or form am I proposing limitation on innovation and technological development. But here's what I would say to that charge. It seems to me that part of the liberal order is that we generally become laissez-faire when it comes to technological developments. That technological developments are understood as a kind of de facto, just fact of our existence, that every technological development is something that we just leave to the social order to figure it out, and largely to assume that it will result in a positive good, a net positive good for human beings. I think a good society has to exercise more deliberation about any change of this sort. And one good example of this is, it seems to me, is the technology that you're most steeped in, the kind of social media, cellular phones, and so forth. This grand experiment in a fundamental shift in how human beings relate to each other that we have never really discussed as a civilization. We've never really talked about this as nations, and whether or not having an entire generation of young people more or less fixed to screens from the time that they're 5 years old is a good thing. And I think there's just increasing evidence that it's actually quite bad for the formation of young people. And there's every good reason for a society to say this form of technology needs to be limited. Right? We do this with automobiles. You're not allowed to drive an automobile until you're a certain age. We do this with cigarettes. You're not allowed to smoke until you're a certain age, and you shouldn't smoke at all. There are certain technologies that are bad for us, and a cigarette is a technology. And it seems to me that a good civilization is able to and has the ability to evaluate any kind of technological form. Now, does that mean it's always going to get it right? No, it doesn't. It means it may occasionally get it wrong, and it can reevaluate. But it does seem to me that simply to say, well, in the absence of certainty of how we should evaluate this technology, we're just going to go with no evaluation. That seems to me a really bad way to organize a civilization. And in that sense, I think a post-liberal order would be serious about thinking about technology as in its social and political implications, and not just as a kind of something that pops up and we just have to submit to its logic.
So I suppose don't let children under 18 change their gender, as absurd as that would have sounded 10 years ago.
Right.
Oscar,
Right.
if you want to take it away.
Yeah.
Sorry.
I'm going to have to ask if we can make this the last question, or if you have a question you wanted to ask last, and I apologize for that.
No problem. Actually, Oscar, did Tocqueville, Oscar?
Tocqueville.
Mm-hmm.
Thank you. Sorry, I'll just ask this. In post-war Britain and many other countries, after the war especially, nationalized heavy industries, and their unions were often seen as homes of community and camaraderie among workers and neighbors who sort of all had the same job. Most famously, the coal mines and the National Union mine workers. Is the middle class economy that replaced it in the 80s, is that compatible with the post-liberal concept, the sort of Aristotelian mixed constitution?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, of course, it's more difficult and challenging because a lot more work is no longer necessarily in place in a community in the same way. The kind of conditions that gave rise to certain forms of solidarity, to use the good Catholic word, are less evident in many instances. But I do think that there's a way in which, again, from the perspective of the heights of contemporary elites, the world is a lot more globalized than many people experience it. The kinds of industries and businesses that people engage in have changed. Maybe coal mining isn't quite as the prevalent industry in parts of England and Ireland and the United States. But we have massive numbers of people who are in the service industry today. In fact, that's probably the largest percentage of workers in the United States today are people who work in the service sector. The service sector is notoriously a bad employment. It's bad for employees in almost every sort of measurable effect. Very little by way of benefits, very little by way of able to sort of have a say in the workplace. And this is often large chain stores or large companies in which the service sector has little say. People who work at the low levels, sort of the direct caregivers in hospital systems have very little say within those hospital and healthcare systems. So we've organized a kind of workforce that's in lots of ways different from the one you just mentioned. But in lots of respects, it has a lot of the same problems, which is the workforce is largely exploited, has very little influence and say, gets very few benefits, low pay, easily dismissed, easily fired, and is the kind of work that can be, sort of stunting without the kinds of, it seems to me, the kinds of solidarity and the benefits of solidarity that existed perhaps in those communities. So it seems to me that that's an area where if we just look at, okay, the coal mining world and the farmer world, that's kind of declining, we might miss how extensively and how large a percentage of the population is engaged in kinds of work in which we have challenging problems, maybe not physically as dangerous, but I think as a matter of sort of workplace fairness and meaning is deserving of the same kind of attentiveness. And I think this is one area where there needs to be significantly more power tilted to the side of the workforce and the ability to negotiate, to have those Machiavellian means of kind of extracting concessions from those who have benefited from these arrangements. This is one area where I think it would be actually beneficial for us to think about promoting forms of solidarity in new ways, but ways that aren't entirely unfamiliar.
Well, thank you so much for joining us.
You're welcome.
Pleasure talking to you.
Wonderful questions. I really appreciate it. I'm extremely impressed and
Thanks,
Yeah,
thanks so much.
yeah.
Maybe one day we'll study under you. Who knows?
Absolutely. Yeah. Well, I do get out your way occasionally, not as much as I'd like to, but
Yeah. Thanks so much for joining us. And thanks for everyone listening. Listen. We'll probably do another one next week. So